Welcome to Binge the Bible bonus features, a podcast where we dive into the crazy, unexpected, and interesting details that we didn't have time to talk about on Sunday. When you get into God's Word gets into you. We want to help you get into the Bible, understand the Bible, and apply the Bible. And our hope is that bonus features will help you do that. Well, guys, I am here today for episode 2 of Binge the Bible. I'm joined. My name is Caroline, joined by our pastors, Pastor Jeff.
So good to be here.
Pastor Kevin.
Great to be hanging out with you guys.
And our resident pastor nerd, Pastor Jason.
All right, Pastor Nerd.
Can I just comment on the nerd thing?
Please.
I was labeled last week,
honor.
and so everybody that I talked to over the last week in the church yesterday referred to me as the nerd. One lady even said that she's like, Pastor Jason, I didn't realize you hide it so well.
I don't even know what how to interpret that.
Deb Palazzo, shout out to her. She's awesome, by the way. But yeah, so I do hide it well.
It just
Well, I'm
means that you're
encouraged.
smart.
That means people are listening.
That is
People
true.
are tuning in.
awesome.
So thank you.
That is
Keep
awesome.
tuning in. We'll keep calling pastors nerds.
Yeah, honorably. Well, Pastor Jeff, if you want to talk a little bit about, why we're doing bonus features, what we're planning on getting out of it.
Absolutely. Well, the bonus features are really to allow us to dig a little bit deeper into the books that we're studying. We've only got so much time on the weekend, and so as much as I'm trying to cram the entirety of the book into the weekend, we just can't do that. So along with the weekend teaching, we've also got 5 days of reading that Pastor Jason is identifying that we're going through as a church. All of that is available, lifepointnow.com/binge the Bible. You can get each weekly reading there. And then on top of that, we're going a little bit deeper here in our discussion time. It's really been on my heart that we would see just an increase in the engagement of God's word around our church. Really felt like God said, listen, let's dial up, let's turn up the intentionality in prayer, intensity in worship, and engagement in God's word. And so this is a way for us to just help people put the pieces of the puzzle together, because while it is the number one selling book, although we know it's a library, not a book, it can also be the number one most confusing, challenging, and intimidating. So we want to try to remove all that and help it make sense.
That's good. Well, last week we covered Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible. Today for episode 2, we are going into Exodus. If you guys have one of the Lifepoint Bibles, we've been selling Bible bundles. Pastor Jeff has one.
Yes, we have. Got one right here.
Yeah, we've sold nearly 400 of these so
That's
far
incredible.
in this series. Yeah, it's pretty awesome. So it comes with a Lifepoint branded Bible, a journal, a highlighter, a pen, and they're available, for 3 easy payments of $5. $5.
3 easy payments of
a Lifepoint campus near you. Well, if you did miss, you can go back and listen to Genesis. And today, actually, we're gonna, like I said, we're gonna go into Exodus. So if you like what you hear, if you've learned something, make sure to like, subscribe, share, review, all those good things that helps us keep doing what we're doing.
Every bit of that's a big help. I noticed we had over 300 views on our YouTube video, but 33 likes. So I don't know if that just means that a bunch of people didn't like it or they just didn't want to push that button. So I know it may not seem like a big deal, but hey, it means a lot. So be sure to hit that like button while you're watching. Subscribe if you haven't done so.
That's good. Well, like you said, Pastor Jeff, we couldn't cover everything. You couldn't cover it all in the message. We couldn't cover it all yesterday listening to Exodus. So any quick thoughts, quick hits, some takeaways that you guys maybe heard that you wanted to expound upon a little bit from yesterday?
Well, I loved everything I heard.
Yeah.
Let's lead with that.
I'll jump into one thing. This is sort of topic related to the message, but it's also just related to the Bible bundles. I was sitting next to both of my daughters yesterday, my youngest, Sydney, who's a 16-year-old in our student ministry, and she's just furiously taking notes the entire time. Last night, she's reviewing the notes. And so I know just across the church, just to kind of hear people in the Bible, in the service, you can hear pages turning, but also to see the engagement that's just high. We're seeing it from YouTube views. We're seeing it from, I think our podcast is up like 60% at this point. And so we're just seeing like a hunger for God's word. And I think for me, outside of just what we talked about in Exodus, just seeing that hunger just continue to drive, we're seeing it impact things across the landscape of the church as a whole. It's exciting.
Well, I shared last week as we were starting this that there's a little bit of an intimidation on my part just trying to teach the entirety of the Bible. and wondering, is it going to, does it connect with people? And so I was super encouraged. Sunday, I'm getting ready to preach, and somebody, two people were there, and they posted a picture. They had their Bible bundles and the stage, their Bible bundles in the stage, and they posted a picture saying, we've got our bundles, and we're ready to get into the Word. And
that's cool.
Awesome.
You want to encourage your pastor, let him know that that you're interested, you're hungry for the Word. It's hard to feed people who aren't hungry. So when people show up and they got their Bibles and they're hungry, man, it's encouraging. It really is. Meant a lot to me. As you were talking about last week, the engagement in the Word, what is it, 4 times a week? The statistics are kind of proof that, the more we're engaged in God's Word, the more that our lives are changed kind of all over. Yeah. So that's really encouraging. Yes. Yeah, life change happens 4 times or more. Mm-hmm. Or more. It's good. You were asking about things that stood out. I just thought, not to try to do any kind of a recap, but I love how one book leaves off and the other one picks up. You really start piecing this story together. I was telling somebody today over lunch that I, for 16 years as the pastor of Lifepoint, and then for 8 years as youth minister, I've taught Bible stories, but I've never weaved them all together. And when you do a series like this, you start seeing how they all weave together. And so the fact that Genesis leaves off with the Israelites, they're in Egypt due to famine and favor. Famine in the land, and then favor on the life of Joseph. And that's where we begin to pick up. So if you're ever like, why in the world did they need an exodus out of Egypt? Why were they ever there? Well, just finish up Genesis. Like, the story is continuing. And so it's neat to be able to piece it all together like that.
Yeah, and Pastor, that was one of the things that kind of stood out for me, because I love the history of the Bible. I love studying. My mind automatically tries to connect dots a lot of the times. And just the way you painted the picture of parting the Red Sea, walking through that, but then you made the statement, you said that after all God had done for them, that they would never question or doubt, right?
Right. I'll never doubt you again. I'll never question.
And I've never seen physically God part waters, whether it's like a bottle of water or like a lake or river or an ocean. I've never actually seen that. And so I'd love to think that if I did, that I wouldn't doubt. But in the instance, I have seen God move, but I still question or doubt, well, is he going to do it again? Is he still with me? And you can fall into that. And so it's crazy how this story kind of starts connecting the same themes we see all through the Bible, but also the same things that I tend to see in my life, and even talking to people here in the Wilmington area. Like, we see God do these things. Lifepoint, even from the beginning, we started really small, and now we see all these amazing things that God's done, but we can get caught up in the distraction of like, well, is he still with us? Do we need to do our own thing? So I love that you brought that up and just made it super relatable.
Yeah.
It's good.
That's good. Well, one of the things that we talked through last week with Genesis is major moments, some key things that we saw, some key things that we got to go through, the themes. So Pastor Jason, you kind of led us through that. So let's go through some major moments of Exodus.
Well, and so just like last week, one of the things that I love to do, I love to kind of pick out some of the major themes, because most of the time in a book of the Bible, the major themes connect. Just like we talked through with Genesis, it set up stories that would go through the rest of the Bible, like God's authority, God's preservation of life, the idea of blood sacrifice, and all these things kind of foreshadow the movement of the rest of the Bible. And actually, Pastor, what you just said, they connect and tell an entire story. And so kind of the same thing today, like some of the themes that we see in Exodus are God's faithfulness. Because we're going to see that we trust God. Oh, no, we don't trust God. We see that, but he proves his faithfulness. Israel's origins, which to me, I kind of geek on, because in Genesis, we see that you see the people's, their heretical origins, like where they were born, where they came from, their family line. In this one, we see their theological origins, and we see the law of Moses start to come about, and how everything starts to get built. And then the next one is God's name and reputation. And that's one that we'll probably park out on just a little bit more. But then towards the end, we see the law. The law getting ready to come to pass, and the 10 Commandments coming alive, and Charlton Heston. Wait, we hadn't gotten to that yet. Sorry.
You brought it up.
Yeah,
Charlton Heston is the man. Can I just say that voice?
One
wow.
survey question: who was the better Moses, Charlton Heston, or the Prince of Egypt?
I just want to go on record and say I've never seen either of them.
I haven't either. Bad. Okay, thank you, because I haven't either.
Yeah, so I have. You're good. You don't have to rewatch.
I didn't miss anything.
You're good. No, you're good.
Hey,
you're good.
Caroline, you haven't seen the Prince of Egypt?
That's the animated one, yeah.
I just feel you
No.
have seen that.
I honestly really appreciate that you are astounded that I haven't seen it because that does feel very Caroline.
I was like, that's
no, I have not.
a completely Caroline thing to watch.
Yeah, I feel like I should be offended by that, but really I'm just honored.
It's all good stuff.
You were talking through all the different themes. I jumped in because you said Prince of Egypt or Charlton Heston.
If you can't tell, it's easy for us to chase a rabbit here. So,
I like that. I mean, just chasing the rabbit, I am a Charlton Heston fan. He's a hero of mine. I mean, I didn't stop with Ten Commandments. I can go on to Ben-Hur. I like old movies and geek stuff, so that was good. But we'll pick up just in the first thing. I mean, to me, one of the first big moments is the fact that Moses escapes genocide. And Pastor, you spent a little bit of time on that yesterday.
Yeah.
But it's a crazy story. Like,
Absolutely.
None of those things should have happened. He never should have gotten to where he was. So I figured we could park on that just a little bit because that's where we start to see God's faithfulness and the reoccurring theme of God preserving life.
Well, chapter 1 opens up with this idea that in verse 8, a new king who knew nothing of Joseph. So Joseph was literally, functionally speaking, the savior of Egypt. And so now he's a nobody. The new king knows nothing of him, nothing of what he's done. And so all of these Hebrews who have now relocated, man, they have just been over 400 years, been growing in number. And so now they're afraid. They're like, what are we going to do? If they just keep multiplying, they're going to take sides with one of our enemies. We got to control the population. And so literally there is this genocide of Hebrew boys. If it's a boy, just throw him into the Nile. If it's a girl, you can keep her. But if it's a boy, get rid of him. And we obviously know the significance, the value of life. And it's crazy to think that Moses' parents were like, we're not doing that. Now, the miracle that nobody really talks about is the fact that they kept him hidden for 3 years.
Which, have you ever met a 3-year-old? That's shocking.
Yeah, how did your terrible twos, how do you keep that on the DL?
Yeah.
A crying baby in the middle of the night.
No
So that is a
tantrums,
miracle that nobody really talks about.
Yeah.
But it happened. So chapter 2, we see the birth, the hiding of Moses. And we just get these moments from his life. We see where Moses, his mother finally puts him in the reed basket and sends him on down the Nile. But God, in his sovereignty, he has somebody there to pluck him out of the Nile. Tell that part of the story real quick, Jason.
Well, I mean, and
I know you want to.
The immediate imagery in my head though is because you're wading into the Nile. I've never been to the Nile. And Carol, I think you have.
I have.
You've been to Uganda, so you've seen it. I just think Nile crocodiles.
Yeah, they're real. I've
like
seen
a
them.
snack.
I mean, because those things are huge. They're bigger than. I mean, I don't want to geek out too much because I can geek out in the.
I can tell you a quick side story. Okay, it has absolutely nothing to do with this book, but we were. I was on a tour on the Nile, and we saw this buffalo just floating. I'm sorry, not a buffalo. It was a hippo. Yeah, definitely not a buffalo. A hippo floating in the Nile, and all of these crocs were on it. And so we're all like, this is the most amazing thing. We're watching this just, nature is metal unfolding right before us. They were death rolling, ripping it to pieces. And about that time, the wind shifted.
It was.
And it engulfed. Were you on that trip?
I was on that.
Engulfed our boat. It was, death was on us.
I would be
But it was awesome.
more worried about the hippos than the crocs for sure.
Yeah, hippos are
Oh yeah,
angry.
hippos. Little baby floating down in a basket. Well, that was one of my favorite stories because it says that in chapter 2 verse 2 the woman became pregnant, gave birth to a son. She saw that he was a special baby, kept him hid for 3 months, but when she could no longer hide him, she got a basket made of papyrus reeds and waterproofed it with tar and pitch. Crazy ingenuity. She put the baby in the basket, laid it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile River with the hippos and the crocodiles, and the baby's sister then stood at the distance watching to see. Would she jump in and saved him if she saw a hippo or a crocodile? I just think through these things. So soon Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the river, and her attendants walked along the riverbank. When the princess saw the basket among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it for her. When the princess opened it, she didn't. She was afraid of crocodiles.
She's like, I hope she wouldn't jump in the Nile. And I'm like,
what is that? Go get it.
Yeah. Bet.
The little boy was crying. After all that time, he's finally crying. Little boy was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This must be one of the Hebrew children, she said. So it's not like she didn't know that he was a Hebrew. Mm-hmm. I gotta believe that she was aware of the genocide that Pharaoh had passed down. And so the fact that God stepped in, preserved the baby, and she was able to adopt him and bring him in to his house.
Well, and correction
I kind of think God was kind of like slapping the Egyptian gods from the get-go, like, hey, you are banishing my people. I'm going to put one in your house.
Yeah.
That's good.
Well, and correction on my part, because I had the number 3 in my head. I was like, how in the world did they keep him until the age of 3? They kept him until the age of 3 months. Okay. So I'm like, he's in his terrible twos running around. I'm like, how is he staying in the basket? Okay. He's 3 months old.
Well, I know where you got that, because after that, they called for a nurse, and it happened to be his mom. And so she would have taken care of him and nursed him for probably 3 years.
That's what I was getting at.
Which
That's
is
what I meant
another
completely.
like God orchestrating things.
Yeah.
That the mom actually becomes the nurse and is still able to raise the child.
Right, what are the odds?
Exactly. And it just shows, to me, it shows just God's provision. Like how God continually, even when we do feel like everything's working against us, that we never know the things that God is putting into place and into motion, so that we can, like, not only just he can deliver, but he actually delivered through the hands of the enemy. Like Moses was raised in Pharaoh's house. Like, just that simple fact, it's a script that we would never write, but God often orchestrates in our lives.
That's amazing.
Yeah. I just, that whole story. And then even to the fact, so, I mean, I love that. I kind of don't like that it doesn't say much about Moses' time in Pharaoh's house, like growing up, like, that's the stuff that I would have wanted to know. You know, in Prince of Egypt, that's kind of the stuff we saw, because he and his brother would sing songs and run around and, you know, cause mischief. But in real life, it didn't say anything. But it does start connecting the dots to how he ended up being exiled in the wilderness. And I don't know if any of you guys really love that story. If you do, feel free to chime in and take over. But he was walking around, and he knew who he was. He knew where he came from, and ended up like seeing 2 Hebrews fighting, and he tried to split them up because he didn't want his people fighting. I guess he kind of wanted to step in, but what he didn't know, and Pastor, I feel like you're ready.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, you know, he jumps in and to kind of break the thing up and ends up killing one of them. And then, you know, poor planning, but he tries to like bury him in the sand, which obviously like a strong breeze comes by and it just imagine like an arm is just hanging out.
He didn't bury him very deep.
Thought he got away with it, but he didn't, because then people are like, "Oh, what, are you going to kill me too?" And he realizes, man, I thought I did this and nobody knew, and so now, you know, he goes from being, you know, the prince of Egypt to he's running for his life and flees.
Well, and almost overnight.
Yeah.
You know, so he's leaving to a place that, I mean, I'm guessing that he was educated enough to know where he was going, but to not have any people there, or, I mean, there's really no way of knowing how he ended up there. But again, we see God's provision at work. You know, when he goes into it and knows no one, we see him in chapter 2, verse 19, with the account that Zipporah, who is eventually becomes his wife, and she kind of tells the story of how they met, and it just kind of condenses it. But she's telling her father, an Egyptian rescued us from shepherds, and then he drew water for us and watered our flocks. Her father said, then where is he? Why did you leave him there? Invite him to come and eat with us. So from the get-go, Moses gets the invitation from his soon-to-be father-in-law.
Jethro.
I mean, like, hand of favor, like, already. So were you guys accepted by your father-in-laws that quickly?
Yeah, I won him over pretty fast.
Yeah, I
as you
didn't
can
have
imagine.
much. I didn't have that big of an issue.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's
I was
good.
invited
thought we could have
over
gotten
to eat
some more
quick.
issues out.
Yeah.
while we
No,
got there.
no issues. No issues. All good. Thank goodness.
But it's such a cool story how he just gets pulled in to Jethro's house. Eventually, we don't know how much time elapsed, but we see that eventually he was given the hand of Zipporah to become his wife. They had a kid. He named him Gershom to I guess to be kind of an idea that he was a foreigner living in a foreign land. He still considered himself part of the Egyptians, and then just took over as a shepherd. So any pull any insight from there before we move into like kind of like arguably one of the biggest stories of Exodus?
Well, I just think just worth noting at the end of chapter 2, it says, during that long period, the king of Egypt died. So he had influence. He ran from it. He has now got a life, and there's a transition in leadership over, you know, king of Egypt. So it's not like I often picture that, you know, he's marching back to the same king that he was serving under, but it wasn't. It's a transition and a change of pharaohs as we go into chapter 3.
Well, and I do feel like that was one place that the prince of Egypt kind of got it right, because it does seem like when Moses does return, it's like the death sentence isn't still in play. Like he had a little bit of favor walking back into Egypt. I do believe that a lot of that was divinely given, but the fact that the king was died is a detail that a lot of people would lose. Now going into chapter 3, this is, next to the Ten Commandments and the Red Sea, this is probably one of the biggest stories, and most people that don't even know the Bible probably tend to be more familiar with this story. Pastor Kevin, do you want to set this up? This is Moses in the burning bush. Like, how do you see this playing out in your head?
Yeah, so Moses is, first of all, to something that you guys both said earlier, he was sort of a foreigner in a foreign land. But it was sort of that way since birth for him. Mm-hmm. Growing up in Egypt, he was that way. Fleeing to Midian, he was that way. So I like to think of where Moses was. And sometimes we just live this way, right? Where we don't feel like we ever are where our feet are planted. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that actually sets up what's next for him. Because Moses is a shepherd. Mm-hmm. He's out shepherding sheep that belong to his father-in-law. So even what he's tending right there doesn't belong to him. Like nothing is his. Everything is sort of borrowed or on lease in his life. And so as he's out kind of on the backside of the wilderness, he comes to Horeb, the mountain of God, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him. And what we know, and we call it the burning bush, right. And really back then, what would happen oftentimes is you're in the desert. So oftentimes bushes would catch on fire. Like it was nothing to walk by and see something like this. So any shepherd who was doing what Moses had done had seen something like this. But what happened with this bush is that the Bible says it wasn't consumed. So it was on fire and the flame continued to burn. And that's really what God used to speak to him.
I'm just trying to act like this isn't the first time that I've heard of bushes just burning in the desert on their own. So thank you for
So they
we all know that they always do that.
So back in those times, and still today, like in desert, it's why if you're Southern California where we lived for a little while, fires are just rampant because any little spark can set something ablaze.
Okay, makes sense.
So in those times, like that would continue to happen. Fire was still something that people used, so fires would just happen. But this one was one that it was a singular thing that wasn't spreading as much as it wasn't consumed. Yeah. And so it communicates that God is speaking to him, but he's speaking to him in a unique way. So Moses stopped to see something that was abnormal and kind of out of the ordinary, and God speaks to him through that and calls his name Moses, Moses. Moses says, here I am. I love what God says next. He says, don't come any closer in verse 5, and we know this part of the story as well, but take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground. And then God begins to identify himself. I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And at this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And I just go back to Moses, who spent, come off of 400 years of seeing his people in slavery, knowing about this God, hearing the stories of this God. But he was very much the God of ancestors that Moses had heard about, but just like the rest of the slaves in Egypt, never experienced. And now, for the first time in 400 years, an Israelite is experiencing God, which is a completely different level of intimacy than what we've seen happen so far, in the story of Exodus.
Well, think about how much that applies to us. I mean, how many people can say, I've heard stories of God, but to have an encounter for yourself? I mean, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, that's great, but that's like, so many people, it's like, well, my parents grew up going to church. My grandparents went to church. It's like, okay, have you ever had an encounter for yourself? And he has this. It is literally a life-changing encounter, which is interesting because everybody that has an encounter with God leaves changed. But it's about to change his life in a drastic way.
Yeah.
And do you love the foreshadowing there? We're talking about a massive, holy God that he warns Moses to be careful approaching and gives him something to follow. God's already making a way for us to be able to come into his presence. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the key points for that story that I've always walked away from. He constantly, through the word, he's making a way for us to be able to come to him and be in his presence and to get to know him, which speaks highly of the relational value. But also, this is kind of a throwback to last week, Caroline, Pastor Jeff, and Pastor Kevin. I feel like you'll kind of dig this a little bit. Like we picked out songs that had kind of come out of Genesis.
Good.
Did you guys see a song?
Right.
Did you guys see the song?
That's great. Awesome.
Caroline loves this part.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I can't sing. I don't want
to.
Please sing it.
You can't sing. You're on a worship team.
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
Wait a minute.
I don't have a guitar. I don't know what to do with my hands when I sing. But I'm just taking back to like every special that was sung at my church as a kid, or like little altar calls. And you're standing on holy ground.
I was in Pharaoh.
You were in BBS
land. Baby, let my people go. Yeah. Burning bush told me just the other day.
So So many fun songs
Anyways.
from the Bible.
Moving on.
So, and Caroline, if you see any songs that just kind of jump out to you as we read through, feel free to sing
I'll
out.
break out in it.
Yeah.
Don't
Singing
you worry.
Full
Something
show
about the
tunes. And so let's just move in from the burning bush, move into like Moses kind of walking through it. Now he's coming into Egypt, lines up with, actually, before that, he was being caught at the burning bush. And Pastor Kevin, you have an interesting take on the signs and wonders that Moses experienced.
It's a take. It's a hot take. So, so for me, so Moses is called by God, going to Egypt, command Pharaoh to let my people go. And essentially, Moses does something that probably we would do too. Like, God, how can I prove it? Like, if they ask me if I really saw you and I'm really called by you, like, how do I prove that? And so God gives him some signs. And he gives him one of stick your hand in your coat, pull it out. It was full of leprosy, and then it was cured. And Moses said, I'm slow of speech. There were just some different things there. But the one that gets me was the very first, proof. And he says, throw your staff down on the ground. Moses throws his staff down on the ground, and it becomes now here's my thought. It becomes a snake. Okay, so let's just start there. So this is not a stick. This is a staff.
How big is this?
You know what that means where I come from? Big old snake. That's what that means.
Gandalf.
So in case you guys don't know this, the guys here at the table do. So I have a phobia in life, and it is any snake. I can't watch them on TV. I can't hear stories about them. I don't want to hear the sound. I'm out on everything. If my dog ever attacks a snake, good luck, Aspen, right? I'm out. So this story, I remember when I first got saved, I was 18. I'm reading through the Bible, and we're in Exodus, chapter 4 at this point. And I get there, and I thought, okay, is this required? Because this might not be for me. I'm out. This is that kind of church.
Do you ever throw sticks just in case?
So I never throw sticks on the ground, and it is why I quit carrying a staff as well. I used to carry a mean staff.
You
back
seem
in
like
day,
the kind of guy that would carry a staff, so that makes a lot of sense as to why you don't.
Ever tell you my snake story when I was cutting the grass?
Yes.
Yeah. When I was a kid?
Yes.
No, you don't.
Yeah, have you guys heard it? I was real quick for
we
everybody
need
else.
to hear it again.
I'm push mowing my yard, and so I was pushing to empty the bagger so the blade wasn't spinning, and I ran over the tail of a snake, so I didn't chop it up, and it reared up and smacked my leg. I let go of the mower. It went down the hill into the woods. I ran in the house. Mom, look at my leg. Look at my leg. Look at my leg. I was terrified. I was convinced that thing bit me. And so the rest of the yard, I cut walking sideways, just in case there was, because where there's one,
There's many.
there's many.
Wait, you went back to finish the yard?
It was my job. I had to go get the mower out of the
That's
woods.
responsible
So
of you.
the
That's
right
good parenting.
thing to do is just set the whole house on fire at that point. That's kind of the way I roll. So anyway, for Moses, obviously filled with more faith than I am, he actually does, and the Bible says he picks up the tail of the snake, and it becomes the staff.
Full crocodile
again.
hunter technique right there.
Right, yeah. So yeah, your boy's out on that part. Go Moses.
Nope.
And I feel like we do need to warn people listening. If you know Pastor Kevin and you love him and want to stay friends with him,
Don't do it.
Please
don't use this as an outlet to prank him.
Please.
But if you love pranks and
Please. This I will pay to sponsor this episode if we can guarantee that this is not
Sponsored by Please Don't Prank Pastor Kevin.
yeah.
I love you all.
So,
Thank you. in
so
advance.
chapter 4 ends with God almost killing Moses, and if you do this, Pastor Kevin will almost kill you. So
If I'm out for a few minutes, I'm going to pass out right now, and I'll be back after this commercial break.
2 hours later.
Oh, man. So Moses' faith was great. He grabbed a big old snake, and it's crazy. Even after that, he still kind of doubted God. Caroline, you had an interesting take, and you kind of brought this up in one of our text threads as we were kind of prepping for this. But the fact that he still kind of doubted God and did not want God to send him to Egypt. But then it says in verse 14 of chapter 4, the Lord became angry with Moses. And God said, all right, he said, what about your brother, Aaron the Levite? You had kind of an interesting take on there. I didn't know if you'd want to share it real quick.
Did I?
You did, didn't you? You brought it up to me, so I thought it was cool because the fact that you brought that he actually gave him Aaron as a partner in crime and gave him a little bit of a security blanket. But what they didn't see happening was what was going to come after they got into the wilderness of Mount Sinai, and the fact that Aaron loses control of the people, and we see the golden calf, and it is kind of a foreshadowing again of what we see with the people of Israel. What happens in David's time? They didn't want God to be just their only king. They cried out for another king. They got Saul, and then they inherited a whole list of problems because God's perfect will was uncertain, and you just see them start to doubt again. But God again and again proving his faithfulness. So again, we see the theme starts in Exodus of God's faithfulness moving on. And then we see, Aaron and Moses, of course, stepping into Pharaoh's presence back in Egypt. and they
Doesn't go well, does it?
It doesn't go too well. It is. I think it goes semi-well for Moses and Aaron. It doesn't go so well for Pharaoh's servants, but then it doesn't go so well for Pharaoh. Pastor, you want to tell?
Well,
us
I'm just saying it doesn't go well because they finally, like, they're doing the thing that God has told them to do. Let my people go, and Pharaoh says no. And not only that, but I'm going to make it harder. I talked about this in the sermon, but now you're going to make bricks without straw. We're not going to furnish the straw, so now go get the straw. You still got to hit the same quota of bricks. And so the people have got to be like, hey, thanks for the help.
Yeah.
Appreciate it, Moses. Why don't you go help somebody else right now? He's not winning favor with the people.
His
at this
approval
moment.
rating was not high.
Yes.
Well, and one of the things to point out to people here, and this is where, we talked about it a little before, where we start to see God establishing his dominance as the one true God. Because one of the things we see, one of the tensions really throughout the Old Testament, but really, I mean, even now, is the tension between God, his people, and other gods. Mm-hmm. And so one thing that I've learned from just studying the Word for years, that God's always going to get his glory. He's going to get the glory.
Because he doesn't share it.
He doesn't. He is a jealous God, and rightfully so. But we see in this moment that, Moses, throws down, Pastor Kevin, guard your ears.
Well, listen, I know he keeps happening.
He throws the staff down again. It becomes a snake. And Pharaoh laughs. I would have been kind of weirded out, but he gets his sorcerers or whoever to do the same. And we see Moses' snake gobble him up, exercising dominance. And to me, that's a vision in itself.
Oh, he's out.
So I'm out.
Pastor Kevin's out.
I'm out.
But from what we see, that's the first step in God saying, I am Lord over you. Not only did I preserve my people's life with Moses coming into your house, now I'm sending him back, and my miracle is greater than your miracle. And then we walk into the plagues. Mm-hmm. And Caroline, you even brought this up, and we were speaking about it before. Even with the significance of the plagues, it really was establishing dominance over the other Egyptian deities. And Pastor Kevin, I don't know if it was you or Pastor Jeff that brought this up earlier about the fact that it wasn't just to punish the people of Egypt or to force Pharaoh to let them go. But Pastor Kevin, you were saying something else about that.
It's kind of to your point, but it's to kind of flip it around back to the Israelites. So the Israelites had been in captivity for 400 years. So they had heard the stories of their God. They still worshiped their God. They still believed in their God. But practically, they had not seen their God move or do anything or exert dominance in 400 years. So you have to think there were people who were, it was just a ritual and a routine, right? But it wasn't a power at all. And so part of God showing up and doing what he did in such a demonstrative way is to prove it to them as much as to anyone else. And there are just moments where I think, we have that in our lives where we seeing God perform a miracle, seeing God do something, seeing a person we've been praying for years and years come to know Jesus. Like, those are moments where it encourages our faith. And so I think in this instance, and some scholars have wrote about it, that it was as much for the nation of Israel as it was for others. And so it proved dominance to the other gods, but it also proved it and gave some, practically, think about it, it gave some swagger to the people who'd been following him for a long time, that, hey, he definitely is.
Yeah, definitely had a way of building their faith.
Yeah, right.
Well, I thought something that's pretty neat as we round out chapter 5 going into chapter 6, just before all of these plagues, that we see, so things are pretty bad. It's like it went from bad to worse at the end of chapter 5. Chapter 6 starts off and it says, Then the Lord said to Moses, Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand, he will let them go. And because of my mighty hand, he will drive them out of his country. So it's awesome that God's like, I'm going to do this in such a way that Pharaoh is actually going to kick you out. Yeah. You've been asking to be released, but he's actually going to drive you out because of what I'm about to do. And I think it's so critical for us to understand that it looks like there is zero hope, which is always when like God seems to do his best work. It's like, there's 1 second on the clock. All we can do is run a Hail Mary. And God's like, that's my favorite play. And that's what we're seeing. God's like, okay, my turn. Now you're going to see what I can do. A lot of folks,
so
we want to give up at that last moment and feel like, well, there's no hope. And God's like, oh, no.
So good.
There's still time on the clock. Yeah.
Well,
I got you.
And Pastor, and you said it, one of the big themes for this and for Moses writing this and recording this was to teach the people of God to teach the people of Israel who God was and what he did. And you said even week 1 in Genesis that his story is our history. And so a way to record this, what better way to record it and to see God move in a great way is to chronicle this so we wouldn't forget. We would have these all through the ages. But also the fact of God establishing that dominance. And so even moving into the plagues, we see like the plague of blood, frogs, gnats, flies, livestock. And Carolyn, you were saying every single one of these lines up with an Egyptian deity.
Yeah, I think that's actually really interesting because I never really knew that. I kind of was just like, well, he turns the water to blood. That's unfortunate and probably really inconvenient. But no, I mean, it was each plague is targeting one of the major deities of Egypt. So the first one, water to blood, it's God of the Nile. It's the water bearer. The second one, it's a goddess of fertility who had the head of a frog, which was probably really cute.
We wasn't a snake, Pastor Kevin.
Yeah, at least it wasn't that.
Just talking to a frog head lady. The third one, the gnats from dust, which some people, say gnats, lice, fleas. There's not, there's a lot of different conversation around that. But, that was the god of the earth. And I think that part is really interesting because the dust that was referred to in creation of man is now using to plague man. And I think that that's just a really interesting parallel between that. But also the Egyptian priesthood was extremely careful about their hygiene and ritual cleansing. So, we think about like, man, that must have been super annoying. But really it was making them unable to go into worship for their gods because they were seen as unclean. So it wasn't just a pest. It was something that was preventing them from worship. Flies, the fourth one, that's the god of the sun. And this one actually is interesting because it's the head of a scarab beetle, not a fly, which both are horrifying to think about. If you've ever seen the movie The Fly, that is...
Been a minute.
But I'm a Jeff Goldblum fan.
Right
I
there.
love Jeff Goldblum, so that was a great one.
Cinematic masterpiece. But, so even just thinking about, was it scarab beetles? Was it flies? I don't know. Both are horrific to think about because neither are fun to be around. But the fifth one, death of livestock, is a goddess of protection and love with the head of a cow. Poor thing. The number 6, boils and sores. So these are both gods of healing that, the Lord was going for here. And the first direct attack to the people themselves. So the ones up until now have been affecting people, the circumstances around them, but this is the one that really is actually affecting the people.
It also affects I think it's in that plague where it says the magicians, Pharaoh's magicians, the ones who threw their staff on the ground and they became snakes, that kind of stuff. It says they were unable to stand before Moses because of the sores on their body. So it's the first time God actually shut that down.
And that's the last time we see them. That's the last plague they show up, which is cool.
And that was for people and animals.
Yeah. Yeah, Moses took the ashes from the furnace and blew it over the land, and then wherever they landed, people or livestock or whatever, it is where the boils and sores appeared. Gross. 7th, the hail was the goddess of the sky. Fun fact, her name is Nut.
Okay.
Like, is that N-U-T-T or like
Nope.
K?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
N-U-T, like a nut. So that's creative. This one's actually my favorite. Locust is the god of storms and disorder. This god's name is Seth.
What a great name.
All you Seths out there. That's what you're named for. The god of disorder. But also something interesting about the plague of locusts. The previous plague with hail, it destroyed all the crops that were used for making clothing and libations, aka drinks, but not their food source. So none of the food crops were affected with hail, but this one took out all the food. So it was really when the first time in the paper, people were like, okay, so this is taking out our food supply too. So then the next one, complete darkness, Ra, the god of the sun, was actually the most worshipped god in Egypt other than Pharaoh. So you can see where this is going.
Yeah, cut him off.
And so the last one is the death of the firstborn. Pharaoh is actually seen as the ultimate power in Egypt and considered to be the son of Ra, the god of the sun himself. So
yeah, so
it's
crazy to see
That's
the
really
escalation, like the escalation in plagues and how it just kept harder and harder and closer to home for Pharaoh, and just to see like God claim glory over it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd heard that before, but I'd never heard it broken down like that. I appreciate that. I often wonder, what was it like to be an Egyptian? Because many of these, it doesn't say this for every single one, but many of these did not happen in Goshen. So where the Hebrew people lived, life was good.
Right.
And so I'm like, what is going on here that is not going on there? I just wonder if they were like, I think I'm ready to move.
Yeah.
Buying me a piece of property over there in Goshen.
Go to Goshen. Yeah, the more severe the plague got, the more protected the children of Israel got.
Yep.
And it's interesting. I read this quote, but it said, by the time the Israelites left Egypt, they and the Egyptians had a clear picture of God's power, God's protection, and God's plan for them. Like just with every single moment. He just clarified
just
that to both
knocking out
parties.
each, all the
He
other
gave them
gods.
confidence and gave the enemy defeat.
Yeah.
It's really strong.
That's good.
Yeah, well, and I know we've got a lot of Exodus. There's so many cool stories, but we can fast forward to their Exodus of Egypt.
Ooh,
Like what
look
I
what
did
you
there.
did there.
Good,
Yeah.
good with words. But
We don't wanna miss that.
even to go a step further, because Pastor, you point out the fact that God told Moses what he was going to do and how he was going to do it, that Pharaoh would actually drive them out. And not only that, they were plundered. Like people were sending their goods with.
Told Abram that way back in Genesis 15, I believe.
So just proving his word left and right.
Absolutely.
So it's awesome to see that.
It
so
is promise fulfilled there in chapter 12. Yep.
something about that covenant is awesome. He's true to his word.
God keeps his word, man. I'm telling you, he does.
But we see them, they plunder Egypt, they leave, they escape through the Red Sea. Does anybody want to park out there for a minute? There is a point of discussion, and we don't have to park on this forever because in the grand scheme of things, it's not a huge thing. In some translations, though, we do see that it's not the Red Sea translated, it's the Sea of Reeds. Does you guys heard that before?
Yeah, I took, in college, I took a class on the Pentateuch or the Torah, which is the first 5 books. And our professor actually was an Old Testament PhD where he studied in Israel for all of the Old Testament stuff. I know no other Old Testament PhDs. But anyway, he talked about the Reed Sea and how they've constantly, and theologians and historians try to disprove, theologians prove, historians often disprove, things that are in the Bible, and the Reed Sea is one of those. So they'll talk about how it was called that because the water would oftentimes be so shallow that grass would poke through. Kind of like here in North Carolina, if you go to the beach, you see the reeds that are there, and that the water would get so shallow that you could walk across certain parts of it. And so the historians would use that to disprove the stories of the Bible. What they could never disprove is what happened to Pharaoh's armies.
Right.
And so they could prove that, okay, it could get shallow enough, but really it could never the water level could never get as high enough, maybe to take out a person, but never to take out a chariot, never to take out a horse, never to take out some of the higher elevated things that were going through the water. So I've heard that before. It's just an interesting kind of thing to study.
And that's the reason I bring it up and say it's not a huge thing because the fact of the matter, whether it was the Sea of Reeds or the Red Sea, the fact that God still did something miraculous.
Right.
I've heard some people say, well, you know what? It could have been the Red Sea, but then it could have been like some sort of tsunami. It could have been a flash flood. Yeah. But Red Sea and Sea of Reeds are typically translated really, really in a similar fashion. Yeah. And it is ancient Hebrew. So it's really tough to get a read on it. But the fact is, Pharaoh's army disappeared and God's people escaped.
Well, I'd love to just point out before they're crossing the Red Sea in Exodus 13, we see the consecration of the firstborn. God is teaching them, I want you to know that the first belongs to me, set it apart, and in some cases sacrifice. And he says that a reason I want you to do this is because in the days to come, in verse 14, your son will ask, what does this mean? And I want you to say to him, with a mighty hand, the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. It hasn't happened yet, but he's saying, I want you to commemorate. And the way that your kids are going to know is for the firstborn. They're going to see you. I mean, these guys, they would raise like flocks for a living. It's not a good business practice to go ahead and consecrate or sacrifice the firstborn to set it aside. But your kids would be like, Dad, why do you do this? He's like, well, because we weren't always free. We used to be slaves. And so they're in the process of becoming free. And God says, let's go ahead and set up a way to remember so that we never forget. And in verse 15 continues on, and it says, this is why I sacrifice to the Lord the first male offspring of every womb and redeem each of my firstborn sons. He says, I want you to know this is why we do this. And I think about how for us, one of the ways when we put God first in our life, it's a reminder to our kids. It's a teaching lesson to our kids. I have these visual memories of going to church, and my dad in his Bible was his tithe check. And it was his way of saying, I do this. I would see it, and I remember thinking, like, why do you do this? I do this because I put God first. Yeah. This isn't what my life's always looked like, and it's just a great reminder. So as we round out chapter 13, if you happen to be, for those of you that joined us this past Sunday, and you saw, I put up a map of the journey where they left Egypt and made their way to Mount Sinai, and if you looked at it, you were like, well, why in the world did they go that way? You know, knowing where the promised land is, there's a shorter route, and if you were wondering that, let me tell you the answer. It's in verse 17 of Exodus 13. It says, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around the desert road toward the Red Sea. So if you ever wonder why they went the way they went, it was God going, y'all ain't ready for battle, which tells me the shortest distance between 2 points is oftentimes not the route that God takes. Right. He is a God of the detours, which is obvious in this story.
Well, it makes you want to ask, like, what's God saving me from? For those of you that are waiting, all of us that go through the waiting, what's God saving me from?
Right. Then right on the heels of that, we get the cloud by day, fire by night, which is just a neat little, okay, thank you for that. It's like, that's your GPS right there.
Yeah.
So,
and that's significant too, for even when we get later and they start building the tabernacle and, you know, God actually starts to reside with them. So but even there, we see God's faithfulness. Even there, you know, he was saving them from a war and scaring them back to Egypt, but he also made a way in the desert. We see in chapter 16, he supplies manna and quail from heaven. You know, Pastor, you were mentioning a little bit about that, just some of your frustrations with.
Right. This story to me is just really neat. I'll just hit it real quick. So the whole community, verse 2, the whole community is grumbling. They're like, we used to sit around pots of meat in Egypt. And I got into that Sunday. I was like, yeah, you also your sons were being killed and you were being beaten and you had to make bricks without straw. So life wasn't as good. The good old days aren't always the good old days. They're just the old days. And so we see them sitting around these pots of meat, and then God gives them quail and manna. And it says they looked at this manna, and it's like flakes on the ground. And they go, what is it? Which is what manna means. It's like, what is it? And God gives them instructions. He says, look, get enough for today, but don't try to store it up. Okay, don't get some for tomorrow. Well, guess what people do? They try to store it up. It's like, come on, folks. They open it the next day. It's got maggots all in it. I'm like, you played yourself. Congratulations. And then they're told that as they approach the Sabbath on the 6th day, get twice as much because it won't be here tomorrow. And so you'll get enough to last. Well, guess what? There are people that don't get enough. They go out there on the 7th day, and they're like, where is it? It was here yesterday. And you're like, morons. Which bottom line is people don't listen to what you say, and not a lot has changed. And then last thing I'll say is this. We're told the manna in verse 35 lasted for 40 years until they got to the promised land. God took it off the menu.
Yeah.
I love that God was faithful, but I would hate to have to eat manna for 40 years. Because I envision like flavorless potato chips. God is awesome.
It's like those little wafers that we have at communion. You're like,
yeah, is that what? Yeah, that's not
Those are
good.
the worst.
No,
not good.
Dinner.
Well, and so we just continue to see God's faithfulness, providing water in the desert. I encourage anybody that's listening or whatever, if you haven't read through Jethro's visit to Moses in chapter 18, get into that, do some of the research, and Jethro's advice that comes a little later in the chapter.
Good.
It's gold.
It's great.
And allow God to speak to you through that because all the Bible is relevant.
I got to throw this in there real quick. I love to teach this one principle. I will do it in like 20 seconds. So we always hear the saying, you got to give up to go up, right? I love to take this idea. So Jethro shows up, watches Moses at work. He's like, this is not good. You're going to wear yourself out. The people are frustrated. You need to empower other leaders. And so Moses takes that advice, does it. Well, do you know what happens in chapter 19 and 20? Moses goes up Mount Sinai. So he gives up authority, goes up Mount Sinai, where he spends time in the presence of God, getting the 10 Commandments. So I'm not telling you that's where you got to give up to go up comes from. That's just a little leadership principle that I love to take away from this passage.
No, that's really
Don't wear
good.
yourself out. Give
good.
up responsibility, empower people, and go up into the next level of leadership, which for Moses was the presence of God. Pretty cool upgrade.
It's really good.
It's good.
Yeah, and Pastor, and you just walked us into the next stage of Exodus too, with Moses getting to Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. And one of the images that I love to see is the fact that it's not just Moses walking up this hill. And I mean, he's up there for 40 days. He cuts the stones out. God engraves them. And have you guys ever picked up like a tombstone or a big old thing of granite or whatever?
No, I sure
I
haven't.
feel like any of you guys that do CrossFit.
you?
It's not a CrossFit.
Flipping tombstones.
Everybody from Columbus County has picked up a tombstone. Just
Y'all need
kidding.
a movie
I'm
theater.
just kidding. There's no way I could budget, but can you imagine climbing this thing, carving these things out, being up there for 40 days, 40 nights? I mean, really get to enjoy God's presence, but then carrying them back down the mountain. Moses was a man's man. That's one of my. I mean, he was Charlton Heston.
Okay, you say so. All right.
But Pastor, you
Charlton Heston was a
transitioned.
CrossFitter. I don't know if you knew that.
He did have kind of the
he was
body of a
CrossFitter.
CrossFitter.
No, he
Yeah,
wasn't.
body of a CrossFitter.
No, he wasn't because
He's
he didn't
swole?
mention
Again,
it.
I haven't seen it.
Oh yeah, he didn't mention it. I guess that's the first rule of doing
Yeah.
CrossFit.
If
You
he
have
was
to
a
talk about
CrossFitter, he would have
CrossFit.
said he was a CrossFitter.
For sure.
That's
100
true.
times.
Yeah,
It's
that's
not
true.
there.
It's not.
That was in Planet of the Apes.
So on Mount Sinai, he gets these 10 commandments. Chapters 21 through 23, God gives them some laws. We don't have time to get into all of that. Chapter 24, the covenant is renewed.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think is interesting is verse 7, the people are like, we'll do everything that you say. We will obey. And, well, we know that didn't last for very long. So,
Yeah.
Carry on.
Yeah, well, and we see like one of the moments is Moses coming back down with the 10 Commandments, and God gave him a warning that the people were going crazy. And so he comes down, and this is where we see, something that Moses asked for was a partner in crime, Aaron, the man guy he could leave in charge while he's up on the mountain. Now, granted, he's gone a long time. Now, he's gone for 40 days. I mean, my squirrel-like attention deficit would have been like, well, he's not coming back, and what are we going to do now? And it does kind of give you a snapshot. For lack of vision, the people perish. For lack of vision, these people went into chaos. And so he comes back down, catches them going completely berserk.
You done messed up now, Aaron.
Done messed up,
And
eh?
don't you love how Aaron just kind of throws everybody else under the bus? And he's just says that they went crazy and they brought all this stuff to me, and I threw all the gold in, and out came this calf. And Pastor, you pointed out in the message yesterday.
It just showed up. I
Weird.
pictured the meme of the little blonde-haired girl that's like, calf came out. I don't know what happened.
It looks like this.
Yeah, no, it is. It just is there.
And then we do see that day, though, when Moses comes back, we see the priestly line of the Levites kind of almost established in that moment, because Moses asked them, he was telling them not to kill him, or what do we do? And so Moses told, where was it? Chapter 25. Moses saw that Aaron had let the people get completely out of control, so much amusement of their enemies. So he stood at the entrance of the camp and shouted, "All of you who are on the Lord's side, come here and join me." And so we see in the chaos that it was all the Levites that gathered around him. And so Moses told them, "This is what the Lord God of Israel says. Each of you take your swords and go back and forth from one end of the camp to the other. Kill everyone, your brothers, friends, and neighbors." And let's see, the Levites obeyed Moses' command, and about 3,000 people died that day. Now, in the 10 Commandments, people just kind of got swallowed up by the earth. But we see in the Bible, it does say that the Levites went forth and they took out everybody that didn't stand for the Lord.
Yeah, and if you continue reading, you'll find, I don't have the verse directly in front of me, but the punishment for worshiping other gods was death. Mm-hmm. And so, it's a serious moment, because there are people that are like, why in the world? I mean, God just told Moses, like, don't kill. This was a judgment for their sin, a judgment for their actions. We have to remember, man, this is a holy God, and they have completely broken his instructions.
And it was a moment of divine justice. And so, and he had to do that to be considered a good God and a good judge. He had to fulfill his law. But it does also point out the fact that the translation even goes, it's not necessarily killing that's against God's law, but it's murder. Murder with the intent to destroy, murder with the intent to take that life, almost like premeditated. And we could get into that even more, because I'm sure that'll be a good question to tackle. But we do see the end result is Moses going back up Sinai and getting another copy of the covenant.
Yeah, one thing I want to say, because I referenced this just briefly on Sunday. I talked about what a great leader Moses is, and if you look in 32, so God is infuriated with the sin of the people. And so verse 31 says, "So Moses went back to the Lord and said, 'Oh, what a great sin these people have committed. They've made themselves gods of gold, but now please forgive their sin. But if not, then blot me out of the book you've written. And he's like, look, take it out on me. You know, as leaders, sometimes what's difficult is you are responsible. And he's like, man, I didn't ask for these people, but they are my people. You know, please forgive them. And I love the fact that he interceded for the people. He really did care about the people, even though they were a pain in the neck, stiff-necked.
It shows, too, like the preparation for God to be present in life. Yeah. Like, I mean, the whole book begins with the nation of Israel's in captivity. God really has to prepare a person who can go in and prepare the way in Moses and say, hey, this is what God needs to do. This is where God's leading us. Pharaoh, let the people go. And God shows himself strong that way to one person. Then it moves forward, and I think it's like right on the heels of they come through the Red Sea. I think it's chapter 15. There's the Song of Miriam where it
little duet
says,
between Moses and Miriam.
Yeah, right. And it actually says, it starts out, and it's
had the time of my life.
How did you get the lyrics for that song?
Yeah.
I just feel like they did. They just crossed the Red Sea. It was the time of their life.
Right.
Do you think they did the Dirty Dancing dance too? There it
Someone
is.
was
There
doing
it
Moses
is.
lifted
Yeah.
Miriam
It was good.
up.
It was
That
good.
They
sounds right.
spun around.
That
Nobody
feels-
puts
that feels
Miriam in a
normal.
corner.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That was it. Yeah.
Nobody puts Miriam in a corner.
Love it.
So, so what happened after that? Where was it?
Like
They're
in the
there.
movie or in
So
the
they
Bible?
sing a duet. There's
Yeah, they sing a
grumbling
duet.
in Marah because the water's bitter.
So that happens. Then God shows up again and reveals himself to Moses, shows his glory to Moses, to one person again. And at each moment, God is like having to refine people before he can show his power to people, all the way up until the very end of the book where it says his glory like encamped with them. And so it's interesting how God shows himself strong, shows himself present, and then shows his glory off. But at every moment, it's like you guys are talking about, he had to purge people who were just not ready to go there. And it's that way in our lives. Like there are times in our life where we're moving in a certain direction with God, and there are certain things about our life that have to purge before God can do that next thing. He can take us into that next season. And to me, a holistic look at the book of Exodus really shows that. It shows God showing himself strong, something has to purge. God shows himself stronger, something has to purge in order for God's glory to really be present and to lead us into what's next.
Yeah. Well, speaking about the presence of God, I love in chapter 33, so on the heels of all of this mess of the calf and people, Moses is interceding for his people, and so he would go away from the camp and set up like a little tent, and he called it the tent of meeting. And so he would meet in this tent, and he would talk to God. And so in 33 verse 12, he has this conversation with God. Moses said to the Lord, you've been telling me to lead these people, but you've not let me know whom you're going to send with me. You've said, I know you by name, and you found favor with me. If you're pleased with me, teach me your ways so that I may know and continue to find favor with you. Remember that this nation is your people. He's like, God, these are your people. The Lord replied, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And here's what I wanted to highlight, verse 15. Then Moses said to him, if your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. So as much of a mess as they were in, he knew that where the presence of the Lord is, there is protection and there is provision. And I think about even what we're seeing happen in our church in this year. It's a hunger for the presence of God.
It's really good.
His presence in the Word, his presence, he inhabits the praises of his people, his presence in worship, his presence in prayer. And a desire is, God, if you lead us there, let's go. But if you want us to stay, we'll stay.
It's really
and
good.
I love his hunger for all of that.
Well, and I love the fact that it comes out of that. And what you guys both were saying is God making a way again to be with his people, to reside with his people, because then we see Moses come back with all of the details for building the tabernacle and a way for God to actually be in the camp with them. And so, Pastor Kevin, I thought it was interesting that you talked about the purge, and we're getting ready to see people have to exercise a certain level of obedience to detail for all the things they had to do to erect the tabernacle.
Yeah. So let's do this. Let's wrap up Exodus. You can take almost the rest of it, and it is the tabernacle. It's how to set it up. We see the work is done. The glory of the Lord fills the tabernacle. And let me just share this as we close. And so verse 33 says, and so Moses finished the work, Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So we leave Exodus. The tabernacle is set up. Moses is on the outside. God is on the inside. And Leviticus is about to change all of that. We just binged Exodus.
We did it.
Episode
binged
2.
We did
it.
it, guys.
We did it. I'm going to be honest. I didn't think that we would spend as much time on Exodus as we did on Genesis, but there's a lot in there.
There's a lot of good stuff. Yeah. So we actually, thank you for Pastor Jason for walking us through the major moments of Exodus. All right. Well, we're actually going to be introing a brand new segment today. Segment
Here we go.
called Inquiring Minds.
Ooh, want to know.
Yeah.
Inquiring minds want to know.
They want to know. So
What do these
we've actually
minds wanna
had
know?
some questions submitted by people that are fans of the show. Raving
we have
fans.
fans?
Yes,
We
we
have
made it, guys.
At least 3.
Thanks, Mom.
What do
Yeah.
we call the Binge the Bible fans? What do we call them?
Ooh.
Some bingers? Or the bingies? Bingers?
Yeah, bingies. Either way, we're good. It's a
Wow, I
winner.
hate both of those. Okay. All right. So, but Benji makes me think of the dog.
I love that dog.
Okay. So the first question that we had submitted, I feel like this is a really good one to get started. So a covering over the temple was made out of dugong skin.
Dugongs.
Yeah.
Dugong.
A dugong, it says here, is a manatee. Where did they get the skin of a manatee in the middle of the desert? And if they had it with them from Egypt, why would one need to bring manatee skin?
That is a great question.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually did a little bit of research on this because I had never heard the word dugong before in my life. I don't know if you guys...
Not heard it, but I have been using that word all day
It's
long.
a great...
We've actually had a game trying to see who can work it into
Yes.
most
I
conversations
could not
today.
work the word dugong in there.
There may or may not have been a meeting this morning where dugong was woven in
At
multiple
least
times.
4 or
Yeah.
5 times.
So here we go. Let's try to explain. So there's when we read through about the coverings, we see the word the badger skins are referenced. I think a badger is a pretty small animal. It would take a whole lot of badger skins. It wouldn't seem like that makes a lot of sense. Well, I was doing a little bit of research, and the word badger, which is found all different places in Exodus as well as Numbers, we're told that the tabernacle was covered with these skins, but translators seem to have been misled by a similarly sounding word, takash. I'm probably not saying that right. Jason, does that sound like a Hebrew word? Takash. I'm trying to use
sounds
my...
correct.
Okay.
Maybe a little more
It's
bland.
Flemmy,
So
so I think it's probably right.
that word could also be translated seal skins. Okay, so it sounds a lot like the word that's used for badger skins. Well, when you start reading about the Arabs of the Sinai Peninsula, they would use this word to talk about dugongs, which are common in the Red Sea. And so it was so the dugong was very plentiful in the shallow waters on the shores of the Red Sea. It's a marine animal that would be between 12 and 30 feet long. Said that they would, it's kind of like a picture like a seal, maybe but the size of a whale. And said they never left the water. They're very easy to catch. They graze on seaweed, which makes a lot of sense that if you were going to capture these, skin them, that makes a great covering for your tent, for the tabernacle. And so there is your dugong.
Water resistant.
Yes.
Wow.
Nerd alert me on that
Dugong.
one.
Yeah.
Dugong gong.
Dugong,
Dugong, gong, gong, a dugong, gong.
Oh, good. We also have a theme song. Okay. So next question.
It's just a good word.
Yeah, it really is. Why is it taught that Moses had a lisp when in another book of the Bible it says Moses was well spoken and him being brought up in Pharaoh's house would have made him into an eloquent speaker?
Yeah, so this is pretty interesting because it's kind of like a lot of when you dive into theology and you start breaking down Jewish theology, there are just a lot of scholars throughout years and years and years and years who have different takes on different things. And this is one of the things where you can dig forever and find infinite amount of takes on it. So just a few that are out there that most of these come from like actual Hebrew scholars who have different things to say. But like one says that there's a belief that Moses, when he was young, growing up in Pharaoh's house, that his tongue was scorched with a hot coal.
I read that
Yeah,
same
I did.
thing.
I read that as well.
And there's even one that goes so far as to say that, and again, this is a story that who knows where this comes from, but he was reaching for Pharaoh's throne, and that Pharaoh, as punishment, did that to him. Now, again, whether that's where that comes from, but that's one of the things that's thrown out.
So
there.
where they come from, there is like popular commentary among rabbis that would accompany every part of the Torah.
Yeah.
And it goes at the end of what we call the books of those books of the Bible. They come at the end, and they're pretty specific to rabbis, and they believe that they were worked on even before Christ, but they were gathered and put together in like somewhere between the 9th and 12th century. So it includes a lot of those stories and a lot of that extra commentary.
Yeah, they'll just unpack that.
My quick thoughts are this, so if you're not familiar with this, it's Exodus 4:10. The Lord said or Moses said to the Lord, because the Lord's like, I'm sending you. And he's like, no, I don't. He says, Lord, I've never been eloquent, neither recently nor in time past, nor since you've spoken to your servant, for I'm slow of speech, I'm slow of tongue. They say that the literal translation means I'm heavy of mouth, I'm heavy of tongue. Some think he had a stuttering problem, some think that he had a lisp. Then in which whoever came up with the word lisp was cruel. Can we just agree? Why did they put a lisp in the
I
word?
never thought about that.
lisp?
That's so mean.
That was mean.
Call it dugong.
So Acts 7:22 says Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power in words and deeds. So one of the things that I was reading was, so he grows up in the house of Pharaoh. He has this great education, but he spent a long time in the wilderness with sheep. He hasn't used that eloquence. He probably had a whole lot of people to talk to. And so maybe he's lost that confidence in speaking to someone of authority. We also know that he was a humble man. Numbers 12, verse 3 says, now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. He was so humble, he bragged about how humble
Didn't he write that?
that he was. But it may have been his humility that was like, I can't do that. Because, public speaking is the number one fear, just ahead of death, which is kind of wild if you think about it.
Yeah.
So they're saying maybe it was his fear. It was his I can't do that. I don't belong there. And so I think when Jeremiah was called by God, what did he say? He's like, I can't do that. I don't know how to speak. I'm too young. So I think there's something intimidating about speaking on behalf of God. I read this quote, and I'll leave this here because we really don't know. But it says, when Moses thought he was ready to deliver Israel, God thought he was not. When God thought Moses was ready to deliver Israel, Moses thought he was not. So whether it was some physical thing or just like, I can't do that, I find that the call of God tends to expose every bit of your uncertainty, your insecurity, your inability. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's what he was dealing with at the same time, too.
There was some shame, lack of confidence. I've heard it said that the most dangerous person to follow who thinks they're called by God is the person who thinks they're ready.
Oh, man, yeah.
And I think this is part of that. It's like all of us around the table, we would never think that we're ready of when God called us. And there are moments where we wake up this morning and go, Lord, I'm not ready.
Exactly.
And so,
Yeah, that's fair. This is actually a question that we got a couple different times. And this was not actually in the form of a question, so we'll teach the Bingies how to ask an actual question, but it's okay. So when God hardens Pharaoh's heart, that seems unfair to Pharaoh. Again, not a question, but let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, something that I was reading is think of the most evil person ever. And Pharaoh was that times like hundreds. He's already slaughtering babies. His heart was already hard. He had a hard heart. And so what we're seeing is, if you read through it, you'll see, I think there's 10 times we see it talking about Pharaoh's heart being hard. The first 5, he hardens his own heart.
Right.
And then you start reading a few times where it says God hardened his heart. And I think that sometimes we can resist the Lord to the point where God goes, if that's how you want it, okay. And I almost feel like he just released Pharaoh to live out the hardness of heart that he so desired, that was already there. My quick thoughts on it. What you got?
It also exposes a fallacy for how we tend to read the Bible, because we are such linear thinkers. And when we read stories, we tend to like to go from A to B and everything is in between. And that's not how God sees everything. We look at God and his sovereignty. That's something that we don't talk a lot about. But I made a note here just from hearing that earlier. But Revelation 21:6, God is above all things and before all things. So he doesn't exist in our idea of time. And so in his sovereignty, knew what Pharaoh was capable of, knew what he was going to do. And in the translations I've seen, does just kind of relinquish him to his own little devices. It also raises the question of, like, when you harden your heart to God so much, like, it just, Pastor, I've heard you preach on this before, how our heart it's just like callous skin. It starts to get more and more and more calloused to the things of God.
Right.
And so to me, it's one of those things of learning how we should read the Bible, and not so much from our perspective, but try to gain the perspective. I've even heard other pastors and theologians say that they believe that it's wrong to read the Bible as a book, but reading it as a conversation from God to seek his insight. So that's just a little extra there. But just learning not to read it as a linear book like we're used to.
Right, and we also have to look at how many times God gave Pharaoh the opportunity to repent and humble himself. And he did the same thing. I mean, we have freedom to choose, and so many people get mad at God. Why would God let this happen in my life? I'm like, well, that was a result of the choices you made. Yeah. Like, God's not the author of evil and the author of sin, but we do live in a world where he allows that. And I think we're looking at an opportunity here where he allowed Pharaoh to continue to operate with that hard heart. He's not going to force that. And unfortunately, there's a lot of consequences that come as a result of that. What else do the inquiring minds want to know?
The inquiring minds, this was one of my favorite questions, I think. So since, Pastor Kevin, you talked about the magicians earlier as when we were talking about the plagues, you brought the magicians up.
Magic.
Yes, magic for all the Harry Potter fans.
I, again, want to go on record that I've never seen one of those.
Never mind. Harry Potter's
Nor
great.
have I attended a party that was themed out after Harry Potter.
I have never attended a
have
party.
those?
Never have I ever.
It's uncomfortable because some
Never
people
will
were
I
and were not
ever.
invited to said party. We're going to move on from that. Anyway.
There's a reason.
There's bitterness. Okay. So since actual magic is performed, are there other instances in the Bible where dark magic is performed? Bonus question, is David Copperfield a demon? At David Copperfield.
I say David Copperfield, maybe not, but David Blaine, I think he is.
Yeah.
There's some weird
he's
stuff
scary.
going on there.
I don't know which
he's
one's
just
which.
superhuman.
You
Honestly, I'm
don't
not sure
have
which
to
one's
watch it, is all I'll say when it comes to some of those guys. You can just choose to keep turning the channel.
Yeah.
So I mean, evil's not new. Darkness is not new. I mean, the New Testament talks about how we don't fight with flesh and blood, but against rulers and principalities and powers of darkness. Like, it's not new. So in the Old Testament, and oftentimes this is the way evil does, is it takes on the form of the day. And so in those days, you went through a litany of gods that they worshipped, and that was scratching the surface of how many of them they actually had. Yeah. And it was the same thing back then. That's one of the ways that evil portrayed itself. And so darkness is going to do everything that it can to push against the reality of God. Yeah. And if it can disprove God, then it wins the hearts of people. I mean, we see that going back to the Pharaoh question. And so, so there were sorcerers, there were magicians, there were dark artists, if you want to, for all the wannabe Hogwarts people. There was a lot of that.
Keep
that
looking
happened
at me
back
for
then.
that. That's fine.
And so it does happen throughout Scripture and throughout history. You see some of that. But then what God does is God proves that he is steady and he is strong, that even in the face of that he shows up stronger than that darkness. And he continues to do that today. It's just in different ways. And the David Copperfield question, I don't really know. I don't quite have the answer.
We don't want to get canceled.
Here's what we'll call David. We'll call him a person that Jesus loves. All right.
That's good. Well, and a lot of times you'll see magic kind of lumped in with sorcerers. And, there is one spirit that I wish to engage with, and that's the Holy Spirit. Any other, I'm just kind of like, no, not for me. Yeah. Ouija boards, not for me. Crystals, not for me. And, you do see Acts 19, Acts 8. You'll see references to magicians, and it's never in a good light. Now, if you're like, oh, I got a card trick, it's magic. Okay, I'm totally down with some sleight of hand. Right. But I don't want to talk to a dead uncle, if that makes sense.
When you think of King Saul, going to see the sorcerer. And here's the thing, even in some of these evil portrayals, they weren't wrong. Mm-hmm. They had insight.
Right. And a lot of times they're just off of what, like a prophet or a seer. Mm-hmm. Like you could, you have those two different things. One is definitely of God and hears from God. One is listening to whatever other God is out there or whatever direction they want to bend people in. And so it was there throughout. I think, and this is one of the things, I had a pastor that I kind of got saved under and grew up under a little bit, shaped my faith. And he used to essentially say, like, to what you just said, Pastor Jeff, like, don't chase the darkness to learn about the darkness.
Right.
And he used this example of that when you go in, work for the government and you're a counterfeiter, you're identifying counterfeit money, that the way they train you is they actually put you in rooms with nothing but the real thing.
Study the truth.
Yeah, you study the real thing so that you're always instantly able to recognize what's not right. And I think for us, it comes back to that. Let's study what is true, what is good, what is noble, what is pure. Let's study the truth of Jesus, and we'll know when something's off. The Bible talks about discernment, just that check in your gut, that check in your heart that only the Holy Spirit can bring.
That's a good
And so I
word,
think
yeah.
for us, it's just let's pursue what's holy, and we'll realize what's not and be able to like walk away from that.
Sounds remarkably like the fruit of the Spirit.
Yeah.
I like it.
Well, Inquiring Minds, I think, is a segment that we'll probably keep around for a little bit. If you guys have questions, you can drop them in the comments, or shoot us an email. We'll put that in the show notes of where you guys can send them. We do have one final question. It's why is God about to kill Moses, leading into our cringe moment of his wife circumcising their son, which we're going to use as a natural segue into our last segment called Cringe the Bible.
Cringe time.
Cringe the Bible. So this the story actually that this question is referencing is in Exodus 4. So Moses has been in Midian and is on his way back to Egypt, and God said in verse 19, "Return to Egypt, for all those who wanted to kill you have died," which to me is like not as encouraging as I feel like that probably was meant to be. It's like they're all dead, so you can just head back there. So all right, cool. So Exodus 4 verses 24 through 26. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." So he let him alone. It was then that she said, "A bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision." So just a little bit of, context of where we're at. There's nothing really happening here. They're just on their way back. Nobody seems to be mad at anybody. So it's kind of confusing as to why the Lord's all of a sudden like, I'm going to kill him. But to answer the question from the segment before, there aren't real specific details, but the idea behind this is that, Moses was to be the example, and he needed to have his personal life in order. So having a son that was uncircumcised is going against and was disobedient to what the Lord had called him to. So, the Lord seemingly randomly being like, hey, I'm, going to kill you. It's like, no, it's going more and more into that refinement process of like, no, you need to be the example to the people before you get there.
Yeah, well, and if you back up generations, you get this covenant of circumcision to Abraham and the descendants. And so eventually, here's Moses, and he's not living according to the instructions and the covenant. And so it's a very important thing. And as we learn through Leviticus, I don't want to give away too much, spoiler alert, the more leadership you have, the more holiness and purity is demanded of you. And the call on his life is massive. And so this, like, draw a line in the sand. Like, am I going to live a life that honors the Lord? Will I lead my family in a way that honors the Lord? Because that's a parent. That's right. His decision. That's not his son's decision. Now, we don't know how old his son is at this point. I sure hope he's a little guy, because my word, if he's
poor guy
beyond
that's not good.
a year old, that's tough.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and, speaking of the cringe factor, I feel like anytime we talk about foreskin, I feel like that probably go into the cringe category.
It's a wee bit cringe, and then she touches Moses' feet with it.
We're thinking, are they sandals?
And that's what I was thinking.
He got some Birkenstocks.
Is the cringe that she had to do the...
Definitely some Birkenstocks.
Yeah, something.
Chacos maybe, but...
Foreskin blood.
So it was that practice of circumcision was actually a part for the Midianites. It was a part of their marriage ritual, which is even...
That's
more
romantic.
Interesting.
That's nice.
So it was before the marriage happened. The husband would be circumcised, the soon-to-be husband would be circumcised, and that was proof that...
Now they really just do like a candle thing or like the sand.
It's gotten
The
a
unity
lot
candle.
easier. It's gotten a lot simpler.
Yeah, I prefer having that done 8 days after I'm born.
Yeah,
I don't want any recollection.
Exactly. And so so it's a different day.
Put a damper on
It's
a party,
different day.
you know?
Right. Cringe.
Okay, so what other kind of cringy moments, Exodus. We talked about a lot of stuff.
That one was the one for me, because and not to get super graphic, but it's the Old Testament. There's a lot of graphic. I just see, like, how Daryl in The Walking Dead like collected the zombie ears, or some of them had them tied around necklaces.
Around a necklace,
yeah.
absolutely.
Like, I hope it wasn't like a trophy.
I hope not.
Coming after heading into Egypt. Like, look what we had to do to get here.
You know how some moms keep like their baby's teeth after they fall out? You think it's like similar
Stacey,
situation?
my wife Stacey thinks that is completely weird.
Oh, good. I was
my
going to say I just
grandparents did
roasted her for that. That's weird.
we don't
But
do
then
that.
you find just like a box of teeth in your house. That's horrifying. So do
Yeah.
you think they did?
I know
the
there
same
is.
thing?
We have like a little thing with some teeth in it. We don't even know which kid they belong to anymore. So
That's disgusting.
that's.
It's hard to top that cringe moment.
Yeah.
Let's call it what it is. In the book
that
of
is
Exodus, that's a tough one to top.
So I agree. There wasn't as near as many cringe moments as we had in Genesis, but this was mine. Okay, mine comes out of chapter 24. They have the people have just re-upped their covenant. They've confirmed their covenant with the Lord, and so in chapter 24, verse 7 says, "Then he took the book of covenant and he read it to the people." So they're hearing about God's promises. He read it to the people. They responded, "We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey." And then verse 8 says, "Moses then took the blood and sprinkled it on the people." And I cringe.
Good times.
So, I just picture everybody's like, "Yes, we're in." And then Moses, like at a concert with a water bottle, just starts. And they're like, I don't, that's gross.
What just happened?
So, Jason, can you explain that for us?
I'm still trying to get past it. I can't stand the smell of blood. So in my head, that's kind of what I'm seeing.
So anyway, that's
not-
cringy to me.
That's cringy. Yeah. It's
And it was symbolic of the blood of the covenant, but nevertheless, I don't want it all.
Do you think he just got a little out of hand? He just got a little carried away. He was like in the moment, hyped up, and he was just like,
It was one of those moments. If you ever went to a Garth Brooks concert back in the day, he would like take water bottles and just like
That was
shake
it,
them all.
just-
I guess it was that.
Well, that's how they
Just had a moment.
consecrated. That's how they consecrated a lot of things, though. They would, blood was in everything. Especially, I would see that as foreshadowing for the Levitical role for the priest, and how they would, because
Don't steal my stuff for next week.
Oh, sorry, I can't speak to your head. That's episode 3.
Okay.
So I'll stop there, but just kind of like a lot of foreshadowing.
Yep.
All right.
Dugong.
Yeah.
A big
You just
takeaway from the
needed a
day.
one last dugong
I
to
just
throw
needed to
in
throw
there.
that
I don't
in
even know that I can hear the word foreshadowing anymore.
I know.
I didn't even
With
want to
what
say
we've
it.
been
I didn't want
talking
to say it.
about,
I was like, wait, we
it's
just talked about
the moment is so
foreshadowing.
cringy. Anything that's like near that, we kind of have like a middle school moment. So
Good.
We could just change the
Congratulations.
word to foreshadowing and give it a wink. Foreshadowing.
Oh, yes. Hey,
All right. Well,
we did it.
we made
we
it.
did it.
Exodus.
We binged it. Binges.
Yes.
I hate
All
that.
right.
I'm gonna
I
work
kind
on
of
that.
like Binge.
You've already said it. Yeah, you've already
I've
said it.
said
too
it
many
For
for
all
times
of our
now.
Binges out there.
We could get a T-shirt.
Hashtag Benji.
Yes.
Hashtag Dugong.
We get a dugong on the back of the shirt. All right, guys. Well, thank you for joining us for episode 2 of Binge the Bible. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, review, all that good stuff. And we will see you next Sunday for Leviticus.
Hashtag Dugong.